a warm welcome. Fantastic to have all you here and probably also some now or later on the screen. So fantastic to have Michiel Heldeweg here, our new professor extraordinary at the law faculty, but with a much broader interfaculty appointment, as he will also teach in system. And I also heard from other faculties that there's a strong interest. So it's great to have you here and to talk about energy transition, which I think is one of the key issues for the future. So I'm very glad to have you and that you're coming back, and I'm looking forward to your inaugural lecture next year. Great to have you here, and the floor is to you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy that you wanted to have me. And I also want to thank you for attending this meeting, those of you who are here, but also those who are Zooming in. I'm happy to see that the title of the presentation didn't scare you off, because it might have done. It's tempting for me to immediately sort of try and translate the title into something else, but I won't, because I hope that as the story goes along, it will unfold itself clearly enough. What I should do, and her name is already at the bottom of this slide, is also pay tribute, so to speak, to a colleague of mine. Let me see if I can actually, or maybe I should switch it. Has it switched off? Could that be? I wanted to switch to the next slide. But, oh, there it is. Yes, sorry. It only goes to show I'm not as tech savvy as I would want to be. Still not the case. Yes, but maybe something needs to happen here. What do you think? Oh, no, now it doesn't work. Or maybe it's a matter of distance. Okay, sorry for that. My colleague Séverine Saintier, who works at Exeter University in the UK, together we worked on this article in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews. And the title of this article is almost as scary as the one for this particular presentation. But as I said, I need to pay tribute to her contribution, given the fact that much of what I will be saying is based upon what is also in this article. So maybe to start with some key observations, which I hope and actually expect that you will share, that in fact energy, when we speak about energy, that this is more than a mere commodity or service, because it's really central to the modern economy. That's one too far forward. That's okay, yeah. So industry relies upon it, modern agriculture relies upon it, households depend upon it, if it's cooking or heating or the appliances that we use in the house. And of course you could thus say that it's actually sort of part of the basic structure of society. The way we organize our lives, the way we have placed our housing, how we deal with mobility, our telecommunication, all of that depends on energy. So it comes as no surprise that energy is seen as one of those services of general interest that carries forth a social value that is also protected under Article 36 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, the right of access to energy being crucial. But as many of you will know, we also recognize this in the Sustainable Development Goals. So SDG number 7 is about access to clean and affordable energy. This is not so much something protected under law as with the Charter, but certainly has political and policy significance, as does SDG 13, which is about climate action. This is what Glasgow is about, you could say, and especially related to energy, how to mitigate climate change. There is, of course, also the adaptation aspect, in as much as we're not able to mitigate. But here with energy, our prime focus is actually on mitigation. And that is also back to law. What the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is about, which speaks of energy, climate being a common concern of humanity, and with that, you could say global action is indeed a primary subject of justice. Just try now, next, please. And so what is the main concern? What is the main challenge here? In technical terms, you could say, well, it's about what energy does and our energy provision system does in terms of the carbon footprint. And you could also approach this in terms of the trias energetica, which is to say that the transition should first of all be about lowering our demand for energy. And then in as much as we still have demand, we should prioritize the use of renewables. And only in as much as we cannot manage in that way, and we do need fossils, then we should make sure that we are as efficient as possible in those uses. That is all key. That's all core business for the energy transition. But there's something more going on. There's also the aspect of the just transition, the aspect of the social change to secure what is known as energy justice. And the sort of shorthand definition for what that entails economic participation in the energy system, with priority for those groups, the vulnerable groups that have largely been kept out in the past, that suffer perhaps under energy poverty. And with this social change aspect, basically the challenge is also on the centralized modes of energy governance that have long dominated in many countries, in many jurisdictions, but which are understood to, in fact, lead to disengaged energy consumers. Their concern with climate change doesn't follow from their consumership, because that is something they can externalize. That is something that the energy company or the government body that organizes energy provision is responsible for. The idea behind the energy transition in the first place, that we're looking for these additional modes of renewable energy expansion. So this is where the footprint and the trias energetica comes in, but also alternative modes of energy governance that are more inclusive. Yes, please. And this is recognizable also, moving to the European theater, if you like, in the Renewable Energy Directive #2, the Recast Energy Directive, which has the adage that citizens should take ownership of the energy transition. So, like I said before, we should move beyond this role play in which citizens are merely energy consumers. The urgency of climate change requires that energy consumers become energy citizens and thus become more engaged with the challenge in front of us. Not only individual persons, individual people, but also in community configurations. And this is where the renewable energy communities come in to play, and they feature in this RED II directive. And the thinking is now, and the challenge also for this presentation, or the mission that I have in presenting it, is to hopefully clarify or convince you that it's important to secure the position of these renewable energy communities in terms of a just transition by energy decentralization and energy democratization. Yes, please. That's all well, at least if you can agree initially, but how is this to be brought about? The thinking is, my thinking is, and this is shared with a broader community of certainly of academics, is that we should strengthen the institutional socio-legal embeddedness of these renewable energy communities. Securing the just transition, not just by having these renewable energy communities, but also ensuring that there is a habitat within which they can flourish. And that this habitat is also strengthened by legal rules. And so to build upon the idea that there is something like a social right of access to affordable and reliable and clean energy from there, the next step would need to be that we have an institutional setting that is resilient, and at the same time, it accommodates the heterogeneity, the differences that might exist between various types of renewable energy communities. Yes, please. And that's a mouthful to speak of affordable and clean and reliable energy. The question might be, can we do all these three things at once? I think yes, I think the general opinion is yes, we can. But there are trade-offs. And that shows, I hope, from the so-called energy trilemma, with the word trilemma expressing that maybe you can't do all three things at the same time. At the top, you have reliability. At the bottom left, you have affordability. At the bottom right, you have sustainability. And the point here of the trade-offs being that if you want to having focused on reliability, as has been the case in the past century, early up till the 80s, and then moving to affordability, there might be those trade-offs where you find that maybe if energy supply is made very efficient, then maybe the reliability is a bit lower, or sustainability might suffer because efficiency might lead to externalizing the ecological footprint, neglecting that in favor of making less costs. Should you choose to put an emphasis on sustainability, then the issue might be with the intermittency of solar and wind, that the reliability suffers, or maybe the systems are more expensive and so the affordability suffers. And I can go on with this. The first transition, as I said, was about the shift from reliability to affordability. Perhaps now with the second transition, we are indeed moving properly in the direction of a more sustainable energy system. And some are saying that this second transition is one where we should actually move radically away from systems in which we can externalize the ecological costs. And to some extent, that's reflected in these maybe pretty randomly selected quotes. If you look at what Van Velen and Van der Horst have said about this, that is still a very modest position, you might say, because they indeed emphasize the importance of energy democratization, but in doing so, they voice this in terms of encouraging greater public involvement and control. Nobody can have an issue with that, I would imagine. It doesn't really sound very radical, although I think it is important. What goes further is the position that Hurst is taking, by the way, a more broad position, not only focused on the energy sector, where he promotes the idea of associate democracy, of bottom-up initiatives in communities, in sort of a polycentric picture of various communities setting up their own initiatives, developing them under their own control. Bottom-up polycentricity, with his thinking being that this can make market economies work better, or maybe actually his thinking is that we should move to different systems than the market, the energy market. And that is clearly the case with John Barry, who speaks of the transformation of the social energy system as being a decision to live in a different kind of society, not simply a low carbon version of the present one. And that's saying pretty much the same as I tried to do earlier in saying, well, there's the technical issue of expanding the renewables, but there's also the element of the social change that we should take into account. Yes, thank you. So, institutional settings, I think it follows from the afore that with this idea of polycentric networks, following a call of justice is what is leading the efforts, and leading in the sense that we look at these different, what are known as tenets of justice that I assume you all will recognize the element of recognition is actually about leaving nobody behind. So making clear, thinking through who is entitled to a fair treatment, procedural justice being about who has a share in, who has a say in the decision making and how, and substantive, or often called distributive justice, which is about how we divide the benefits and the burdens of a certain activity like energy provision. Are we doing that in a fair manner? The institutional setting that we would want to support what is happening in renewable energy communities would have to reflect or actually entrench these tenets of justice to bring about this just transition. So it sort of reasserts a moral dimension of the narrative of the energy transition, one that seems missing under the current competitive energy market. So about the social transformation. Thank you, yes. The Renewable Energy Directive, the recast, number 2, reflects or expresses, sometimes more implicit than explicit, but the need of there being this flexible but still clear institutional setting. It reflects this within how it's defining energy communities, renewable energy communities. It's a pretty loose definition, so different ways in which you could actually shape this. It also makes it clear that it's up to the member states of the European Union to decide on how to actually shape the regimes that regulate the functioning of these communities. So you might say it's a way of experimenting by devolution, allowing different member states to take different courses of action, and then of course evaluating what is actually happening there. So this recognition is a first step towards a just transition, but indeed having these regimes of proper social legal institutional environments is another and is a necessary one. Because it is there that the choices for the type of governance are made, how these communities are to operate, how they relate to other actors in the field. And so that's ultimately the mission of this presentation, to explain a bit more about a possible way of moving forward. Yes. And I'm going to challenge you perhaps a bit more, unless it is actually something that's very much to your liking. But this is about trying to understand what such a setting, such an institutional environment might be about. And there's a short description at the top of this slide. So a structure of opportunities, constraints, push and pull, you might say, that bring about patterns of behavior within the energy sector, how organizations relate with each other, that has a dual nature, because in part, it is something that you can actually see happen, like you see nowadays with an energy company being in transactions with others and transactions across the supply chain, for example. But also there being this normative component in terms of organizations being empowered to undertake certain actions, but also being constrained. So for example, in an energy market, there is vertical unbundling. So across the supply chain, the different roles of generating, distributing, supplying are separated, creating different markets for all of these segments of the chain. If we look at this in a broader view, and I build upon Oliver Williamson here, who's made this analysis, he's painted this picture on different levels of social analysis and different levels of social interaction. You find that right at the top, there is what he calls embeddedness. This is the world where interactions take place and institutional patterns exist that may last hundreds to thousands of years. This is the informal world. This is the world of culture, of tradition, of religion. And that supports in turn a next level that has a shorter lifespan, the 10 to 100 years approximations, of course, which is known as the level of the institutional environments. And this is, for instance, where rules of an energy market are being established, and an energy market that is supposed to exist indeed for tens up till, let's say, 100 years. And it presents the rules of the game, how the market is to the energy market is to function. And within those rules, a next level is that I've abbreviated it to GS, governance structures. This is where the style of gameplay is decided within the rules of, say, the market, such as there being energy firms, energy companies, energy contracting going on in a competitional context. And all of that taking place with a shorter time span, 1 to 10 years. And then within that, there's the daily, the continuous energy provision going on. And the idea is that the lower levels can only function frictionless, there we are, typically to stumble over a word like friction, can only function well and frictionless if they align with the higher levels. That's the idea of vertical alignment. So level 2 is of interest, the institutional environment, and also what sort of style of gameplay. Level 3 is possible within that. That will be my focus. So yes, please, next slide. And Scott is one of those scholars who emphasizes that indeed institutional environments are those where organizations must conform to if they want to legitimately function and have support in their functioning. So the rules of the game of institutional environments are about the mode of governance, the basic type of organization of decision-making and interactions. And that is also solidified, if you like, with legal rules, a legal space of constraints and opportunities for instance, for these energy companies to function within, with having certain abilities, powers, legal powers, or liberties, the freedom to perform certain acts. So what types of governance, what modes are there? Yes, please. There's many ways, of course, of going about this. This is only one. Together with Séverine Saintier, I did here is try and think of modes in terms of there being one particular key interest, like the public interest or the collective group interest or private interests, and combine that with particular types of key relationships, whether interactions happen in terms of commands or orders, hierarchy, or in terms of collaboration or sharing, it's a network, or exchange, like with contracting. And if you combine those two, then, well, that's what you get with 3 by 3. You get 9 different types of what we call modes of governance. And some of them we would not want to live under in the current liberal democracy that we have. But the ones that are colored yellow here are the ones that we do find under liberal democracies in different elaborations and different relations. So those are the public hierarchy, what we would also refer to as the state in the top left, and in the bottom right, the market, the private market or the competitive market. And in between, a third one, the collective network, civil network, which is about collective interests and which is about collaboration and sharing.
Could you explain what exactly is the difference between a collective network and a private network? Is there a clear line?
Thank you for the question, because I suddenly realized that I forgot to say one thing. This is an ideal type setup. So indeed, the question of there being a clear line, I think I would have to answer that negatively. The zillions of discussions about indeed the shades of interests. As we will see, there are many hybrids, so I'll come to that as well. But the idea about the collective is that it is at a group level, so it's a shared thing between various people, whereas with the private interest, it is about solely the individual person or organization, but then already you would say, if you speak about an organization, that could be a community. So there are...
Could a public-private cooperation model classify as a collective?
I would not say so, but maybe it becomes clearer as I progress, because then it will show that there are all kinds of hybrids. So this is the point of departure where you would say the world is fairly sort of transparent or simple in terms of we have those three. Maybe we can move to the next slide for that. What can I say? This is an elaboration that, of course, by no means could I actually discuss now, but it shows some more of the diversity in the elaboration of what these different types of modes of governance mean. Very much at the bottom, you can see how they differ in terms of what are the key elements of the legal space, how the legal space is defined for each of those. But we should move forward actually to the next slide to maybe make this different point, which is already touched upon, I think with good intuition or cognition, I'm not sure. Because we can position these modes of governance also in what is known as the governance triangle. And then here at the top, you would have what we know often popularly as the state. And then at the bottom left, we have the competitive market. In the bottom right, we have civil networks. But it also shows that there are many, and in fact, many more hybrids in between. So within the state and the market, we have, well, sometimes state enterprises or public-private partnerships, or you have something like a regulated market, such as that of commercial healthcare companies that are constrained in their freedom of operating for the sake of the general interest, the public interest. So they have a private interest, perhaps, of making a profit. And at the same time, there's also the public interest to constrain them and have quality demands on how they perform. And similarly, between government or the state and networks, there might be hybrid modes of governance, like with subsidy schemes for social welfare. Government creates regimes that bring that certain non-governmental organizations, not-for-profit organizations, can get the funding, but only if they abide by the rules that government has said. So somehow you are in between. And similarly, of course, between competitive market and civil networks, like in the socio-economical sector, there could be agreements and settings that have a hybrid character. And there's also such a thing as being right in the middle, where there's elements of all three modes of governance. In the Netherlands, we often speak of polden, which is typically one of those things where all these representatives from all of these modes of governance work together, such as, by the way, in energy transition. Yes. So I hope that already takes away a bit of the burden that some have felt with this very strict sort of distinction. What I want to show next is what already I think you surmise is that there is this static image of there being all of these modes that can be chosen for certain sectors, but there's also a dynamic here. And as the right part of the picture shows, this is actually like with the red arrow, you could imagine the shift in governance that happened in the first transition in energy, where it was first the state that was responsible for energy provision to later move to a competitive market, or in fact getting stuck halfway in a regulated market. And the question is now whether there would be another shift towards more active role for competitive networks. So that would bring over time shifts in these rules of the game, shifts in the legal space that is available. Yes, thank you.
Any question to that again?
All right.
You earlier spoke about the move from a consumer towards a participating energy citizen. And then on the other hand, you have still the market. But if I understood it right, when this consumer really becomes a citizen, there will not anymore the seller-buyer relation, but they are doing energy on their own, or yeah.
In a community setting, they can do this on their own. They can be the producer. They can have their own, manage their own grid, and they could supply each other. But perhaps, this is the big question, perhaps they can also supply to others. If not, they would only have their civil society network, their civil society community, and exist as such, fully engaged in that activity. Should they start supplying to others? That, of course, begs the question, what mode of governance are we in? Because maybe now we're shifting back to the market. And I wanted to avoid going into this too much, but of course the question could be, can things exist next to each other? Probably yes, because markets, governments, civil society, they already exist side by side. But of course the question with an issue like this is, what are perhaps the constraints that we want to put upon the functioning of, for instance, energy communities? And one of the points there also being, what are the risks of energy communities being captured by either private parties or by government, dictating the course of action, crowding out sort of the members, not having a say anymore, and maybe not having the monetary benefits of what they're doing. So that's exactly the sort of conundrum, you might almost say, that we're facing here. I do need something to keep track of time. Yeah. So I hope that from what was already told, this almost comes naturally, that you see that with the energy trilemma, with the notion of policy choices to foster affordability and now to foster sustainability. So the two arrows, the one down and the other horizontally to the left, that this is the kind of transition that can call for changes in governance where, like with the first transition, there's a move from states to the market and then getting stuck halfway. And now perhaps the move to civil networks being more important. But those kind of changes are not value neutral because they also impact in the constraints and the opportunities in the legal space that defines the functioning of these modes of governance, have impact on how you conceptualize the three tenets of justice. And that's in the next slide, again, with a slide that is overburdened with information. But to show you again, there are the simplistic image of there being these three institutional environments with their own typical mode of governance, and then setting them against procedural justice, substantive justice, and recognition. And to really oversimplify, and I hope I'm not insulting you there, but just to keep the flow going in the narrative. For instance, with procedure, one could say, well, procedural justice under a constitutional order is about one person, one vote. And in the competitive market, it's about one share, one vote. And within civil networks, it's about one member, one vote. There's more complexity, but just to paint the picture. With recognition in the constitutional order and the state, it is about governments and citizens. In the competitive market, it's about firms and customers, consumers, business to business, business to consumer. It's about these shareholders. And in civil society, it's about the communities and their participants, their members. So there's different procedures as to decision-making. There are different rules when it comes to substantive justice, distributive justice, corrective, commutative, collective justice, and also with recognition. So that means actually that the choice that is made upon first a policy choice, we need to transition to sustainability, greater sustainability of our energy supply. And the next step of changing, of shifting in the mode of governance, that also brings differences in terms of how we conceptualize justice in all these three tenets. And that means that we're taking decisions about what kind of energy society we want to live in. And that, yes, indeed. Now, Now, I'd like to focus a bit more on the transition shifts towards the civil energy network perspective, within which there are these energy communities. From the idea, the notion, the thinking that there needs to be normative integrity and resilience. In terms of the thing that we just came up in the discussion, that if there is a particular purpose that makes us choose for a particular mode of governance, then we need to, well, entrench or solidify, safeguard that indeed the values that we're after with this way of doing business in energy supply is being upheld and doesn't sort of trickle down, is that the right expression? Becomes unclear and different types of interests sneak into the way business is being done, like what I said with once a community starts selling to others outside of the community, or there's an investor in the community and suddenly this investor has a say and determines what goes on within the community. Once the camel's nose is inside, the tent rapidly becomes uncomfortable, is a well-known saying, and that might also apply here. Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by the idea of a civil energy network. But when I compare that to other purposes, for example, financial networks, then we always see in the beginning you have these networks, and then they are also institutionalized and also legally regulated. So for me, I would see it's only a transition towards another step of institutionalization and regulation. Or do you see them really long-lasting, stable?
Well, I see them here as institutional environment on this level 2 of 10 to 100 years, and maybe in modern times it's more likely 10 than 100. But at least to make sure that if the choice is made for a particular mode of governance, that we make sure that indeed there is regulation. I mean, the position being that if things spontaneously work well, then law should stay out. Yeah. But at the moment we find out that it isn't working well, or that the transaction costs are too high, then we introduce rules. And I'm assuming that in most cases, with the pressures on these kinds of systems, that would be necessary. So indeed, to have these arrangements of a legal space that are very clear about what powers there are, what freedoms there are, we're always hoping for this sort of spontaneous and voluntary proper focus, but I think that is what will be needed here to make this work. And so we need to, well, as I wrote at the bottom, foster, but also secure that this transition does build upon participatory and economic democratization within these energy communities. So we have to make sure that these mechanisms, these interests are really being realized. Yes, thank you. And I have 2 slides, and actually also a third that refer to work done by Hoffman, the late Hoffman, and High Pippert in the United States. They made a study of a subsidy scheme for solar parks that was completely focused. Well, the thinking was this is to support SMEs, small and medium enterprises. But what actually happened there is that the large utilities managed to sort of create small businesses that they were fully in control of, and thus reap, that's the proper word, subsidies towards the investments that otherwise they would have to do at a much higher price. So something went wrong. The integrity of the arrangement that government had in mind was not upheld. And in their analysis of that, they look at first participatory democratization. So making sure that indeed, like with the community, there is a say of the members in how renewable energy systems are generating energy, how the energy is distributed and consumed. And they say, well, this is actually about, well, I'm reading what is on the slide. We shouldn't actually do this, but to engage individuals in fashioning the nature of the electricity system, and as a consequence, strengthen their lives as citizens. So again, reach beyond them being consumers, make sure that they can be in charge, that they do have the dominant say in what is happening here. And similarly, in the next slide, we look at economic democratization, getting the fair share, popularly put, in what is happening in the functioning of the renewable energy system through a community. And again, Hoffman and Heipipert say, making affordable and renewable energy available to those households previously excluded from the market due to factors such as lack of property. This touches especially on the most vulnerable, those living without property and in energy poverty. The mission is a broader one with recognition, of course, but the basic idea being that we should make sure that this element of democratization also concerns the burdens, but also the benefits of the system that we're setting up. Yes, please. And so you could say we're actually talking about two different ways of going about the energy transition. The rapid expansion of renewable energy systems as a share in the volume of the whole energy production. So how well are we doing in terms of industrial or commercial parameters? How many solar panels are we selling and installing, biofuels, windmills? And if we go about it in that way, if that's our focus, then one could argue that typically the market is the best way of providing that through the private profit incentive. But if we're aiming for this inclusive expansion of renewable energy systems, then to foster the energy citizenship in the energy supply through these mechanisms of participatory and economic democratization would be the way to go. And then to foster this, to have an institutional setting of civil energy networks would be the way to go. And the thing at the bottom is again about this risk of capture that we already spoke about, so I won't reiterate that. Looking at the time, we started a bit later, but I will give you the big picture of this. I already did this before when I showed you matrices with much information and we sort of leapfrogged through it. So I'll also do that now. Part of the article that this presentation is based on is now about what sort of legal form should these energy communities take? What are the limitations in terms of maybe a certain mode of governance not allowing a certain form, or is one form maybe more favorable than the other? As you would probably argue when it comes to a competitive market, you would probably readily say that generally speaking, a corporation is a very sort of executive type of working with shareholders in the back of the decision-making, only on the strategic level. To be forceful, a strong market player. One could, that's just one form of a legal person. The other basic forms that we know since, someone here knows so much better than I do, since the Roman times, about the basic forms like the association, the corporation, the foundation, and they're also being sort of the hybrids again, like the cooperative and the trust. And so you could ask, as I said, maybe looking at these governance triangles, could it be said that the foundation in a public law form, mind you, would be typically the fit with government, with state, and the corporation indeed with the competitive market, and the association with membership first, something fitting with civil networks. And then maybe the cooperative and the trust would be somewhere in a hybrid space. But let's say the elasticity of legal persons is as such that there is a flexibility in how you can apply them. And of course, there are boundaries with that, or sometimes you have to make very complex arrangements within the legal person that lead to all kinds of transaction costs. But this is too simplistic. And so we moved on also to the next slide, looking completely on the left at some other elements in the shape of legal persons. So what is the mission? Who is in control internally? what is their responsiveness to the outside world? What are the sort of key elements that determine their responsiveness? And then to look at, again, those modes of governance and say, well, with each mode of governance, maybe typically you could say that there are different ways in which these three elements should be shaped to ensure that you have the ideal, optimum sort of match with the requirements of that particular mode of governance. But we still feel that this is too simplistic, so we can move forward once more. Yes, and maybe we can again leapfrog. There's a few references here to the recast Renewable Energy Directive. This tells you something about how this directive addresses this element of purpose. The next says something about this element or dimension of control, and the next about response or embeddedness. And so you see that actually the Renewable Energy Directive is shaping indeed a regime within which there are these kinds of requirements that fit with the elements of mission, of control, and of responsiveness that we identified. But again, too simplistic. And so we looked even further, and here it comes, yes. I've always been told that this is not a lecture. I hope you don't see it like that. I'm nervously thinking, how am I ever going to pass the test? But that actually, as you come closer to the end of the presentation, that you should keep it more simple, and how I show you this. So my apologies for that. What this is actually doing is, again, on the left, showing you these dimensions of mission, control, and response as characteristics. But then setting that out against, on the one hand, the different institutional environments, market, then hybrid market, networks, government, and then government or state. And then below that, types of organizations, and then the ambition that ideal typically would fit. So with market, private expansion. But right in the middle is the sort of ideal type setting or match between this civil energy network and legal persons, if they indeed put community purpose central to the mission, if members are in control, and if the community interest is the key element of responsiveness and embedding. Yes, please. So that's trying to work out a framework of thinking, a sort of starting point of reasoning, because we spoke about pure and hybrid forms, and I always say there's black and white, and usually it's gray. And the same applies here, but to have an analytical framework with which you can start your analysis, but also with which you can maybe design, also in terms of legal design is the ambition here. As at the moment, experimentation within Europe is ongoing. This is one slide that we can, I think, just for one moment back, it only shows with the arrows that even if you have this setting in a civil energy network, that there might always be these pools where government is trying to gain control, or the market is trying to gain control. So, and to some extent that might be very logic, because there might be a logic there, because you want to foster stability of these renewable energy communities, viability. So a role of government and a role of private investors might in many cases be necessary. So we need to flesh out how to work with this hybridity. Yes, please. As I said, work in progress, experimentation in Europe is going on. I recently joined a proposal for a call in Europe on fostering a just transition. So the whole ambition of leaving nobody behind was central to the work. Now let's just hope that we actually get the proposal awarded. and then maybe to the next, because I really need to wrap up. Yes, well, very shortly. This is again the discussion that is also gaining strength about that we should move away from, as it is called in German, kurieren am Symptom. We're only looking at the symptoms, trying to cure the symptoms, and we need to move to a different type of society, away from the market that externalizes, that is fed by homo economicus type of thinking, and not homo ecologicus. Which maybe also means that we need to think again about this level 1 of informal traditions and beliefs. But this is difficult stuff to manipulate, if you like. And so finally, I have some questions here that I'm very much interested in, and I hope to have the opportunity in the future to also do some work here, because I can imagine for some that you're saying, well, what does it mean to us, in as much as the us refers to Aruba? In the past, I've done various interviews on Aruba with stakeholders in the energy sector, and it was clear, at least that was 4 or 5 years ago, that it was still a very centralist type of system. But maybe there are already energy communities functioning. I don't actually really know, and I would be highly interested and want to look into this. And maybe there are these issues of energy poverty, which are all the more interesting to see whether somehow these communities could mean something there. As far as this centralism goes, maybe we have to admit that an insular setting is a biophysical, as Eleanor Ostrom would call it, constraint. Economically speaking, there's just no other way. Or maybe the only way is to have complementary systems. I really like to look into that further. There are practical issues. I had a conversation on the dinner table today, on the lunch table actually, about ownership issues for solar panels. Somebody cannot pay the mortgage anymore, and then the house is gone, the solar is also gone. What's happening here? Feed-in tariffs, if you feed in your surplus of energy to the main grid, do you actually get paid for that? Lots of practical issues, and we all know that not only God, but the devil is also in the details. So these are very important. All right, and that brings us to the final slide that was already there for short moment. One of my favorite painters, Jackson Pollock, alias Jack the Dripper. An alcoholic, by the way. I hope that saying that doesn't influence your appreciation for the work. The interesting thing is, maybe you feel like this after my presentation, but the reassuring thing is that this work is called Convergence. So with that, I'd like to...
There's a question from the audience. Do you have 5 minutes for that?
Yeah, sure.
So the question is, are there examples of non-connected islands within Europe testing CAM, and what has been the outcome?
Within the European context, I will have to look it up. So I don't know if it's an anonymous question. I couldn't give...
European islands, let's say, yeah.
European islands, as in, sorry. Non-connected islands in Europe testing. I'm not sure. I haven't come across them, and in the various projects that we did, one earlier for Horizon 2020 unfortunately failed, but we also identified some of those. But I haven't come across them. But it's an intriguing question because it's also intriguing to exactly the Aruban setting and what.
Ik geloof dat ooit wel eens gelezen inderdaad over eiland, waar de communities gewoon helemaal opgericht was. Maar dat is al een aantal jaren terug, dus ik heb het niet meer gevolgd daarna.
Yeah. Oh, that's very good of you to say this, because I suddenly realized that when I speak of island, I mean the physical island with sea around it. But of course, in Europe, there are examples of energy islands in the sense that they decoupled from the main grid. There's actually one quite close to where I'm from, in Sweden, in Germany. I couldn't actually produce the number of them, and of course it could be a risky sort of setting. It is one of those issues, and it's been heavily debated also in Germany, that if you want to go solo, so to speak, what does this actually mean for the support of the main grid? Shouldn't there be the sort of solidarity arrangement that everyone does still contribute to the main grid? Of course, that is a disincentive to the ones wanting to go solo and want to go the extra mile. Then the decision could be maybe taxation is the solution for financing the main grid. I think in many cases, you will find that most communities will always want to have this link, if you have a stretch of really bad weather with, well, maybe no sunshine and not so much wind, and suddenly you're really in a problem, and then to have the connection is sort of the safety net. And having that connection automatically would mean that you also pay. But this is certainly an issue that there's quite a lot of discussion about. Sorry, I mistook the word island there. Yeah.
Yeah, I also have a question. When I saw the directive, you had some extracts from it. I suppose it's maximum harmonization. And then you came with these hybrid forms, which I really like, trust, and especially the cooperative coming from Switzerland the last years. I know the value of cooperatives. So I thought when I read the directive, these hybrid forms would not match when it's a maximum harmonization and you must comply with the rules, as they were only speaking of members or of shareholders. So I
members or shareholders.
How could you then come up with the concept of a hybrid institution fitting with the needs of the directive?
You mean a hybrid in the sense that there is one organization that has both?
And this is the terminology used in the directive in the legal framework. I think
they speak of members.
The hybrid structures. So is the directive so to the point?
I think
uniformity that you not even could apply these hybrid measures, or you would interpret these terms in a more broad sense that you could fit also in a setting?
First of all, it's a bit difficult to say because we simply do not have any case law at the moment. It's just too soon in the game. I would have to revisit the exact wording because what you mean is whether it's either or, so it's shareholders or members, so it's an association or it's a corporation.
Yeah, exactly. Or could you transpose it also in another setting?
I think mixtures are still possible, but it will have to show. But certainly, if that's the point in the question, cooperatives is a main example of a mode, an institutional mode, a governance structure that is seen as fitting with the recast directive. But we just don't exactly know. And as I said earlier, the general feeling is that it is a fairly loose sort of definition still. And it has to crystallize, and we would want to see practices across the various member states to find what is actually possible. The element of locality is also, so that proximity is important. So there are further requirements. There are also requirements in terms of the extent of shareholding. So what share of the shares can one person hold? So on some issues, there is precision. On others, maybe not so much. I still get the feeling I'm not fully grasping the...
but it's the idea how much freedom you still have within this legal context of the directive. Or is it already limiting the outcome as they really say you must comply to these. Sometimes you have it with the directives. Because you don't leave that room that you can really have hybrid forms whatever.
I think there's flexibility as far as this is concerned, but yes, within boundaries, we have to find out where these boundaries, how strict they are. I can't give you more than that at the moment. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for attending this presentation.
Yeah, thank you.